to tonight, and now analysis. As Britain's relations with the rest of Europe continue to be the subject of fierce debate, Ngaire Woods asks why all sides still want more countries to join the European Union.
Britain's relationship with the European Union has plumbed new depths over the beef crisis. But while almost every aspect of our dealings with European partners seems open to question, there's still one issue that commands almost total agreement.
Enlargement eastwards is a moral and political imperative. Europe is like a club. It's condemned to open its doors to new members, provided they're properly qualified.
I'm very much in favour of European enlargement. I believe that it's a moral imperative because, having encouraged the changes in Eastern Europe in 1989 and afterwards, I think we have a responsibility to build up a good, productive economic, political and cultural relationship with those countries.
We ought to admit them because it's the right thing to do. I mean, it's an outrage not to admit them. These are countries that have lived in slavery under a wrong economic system. They adopt democracy, they adopt a market economy, and we ought to allow them to behave like any other democratic market economy. I'm passionately in favour of it.
Conservative MEP Graham Mather, Labour Party spokesperson on Europe Joyce Quinn, and Tory Eurosceptic Norman Lamont. Not only in agreement, but sharing the same sense of a moral imperative. Why is there this sense that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have some kind of moral claim on us? Keith Middlemiss is author of Orchestrating Europe and Professor of Contemporary History at Sussex University.
Where are they to go if they don't go into the community? If you go back in history, these were always the lands between. But if you talk in terms of Christian Europe or architectural Europe or Europe of the Enlightenment, then all these countries are in. So they are locked into a vision of themselves historically, which they can't abandon. Now they've had two goes. They had a go with the West up to the Second World War, and they've had 40 years with the East. They're not likely to repeat the latter experiment, nor in fact is it open to them. So where do they go? Do they remain as a sort of sump or backward area? No. Therefore, the logic is they have got to join the European area.
So why not let them in now? The reason is that the European Union already has enough problems with its 15 members, the BSE crisis being the latest. Still deeper is the problem of monetary union. Governments are incurring huge costs trying to meet the conditions for a single currency. Strikes and demonstrations are being faced even at the very heart of the Union, in France and Germany. Some believe that far from deepening, the European project is beginning to self-destruct. Enlargement can only add to these problems, not a prospect that unduly worries the former Chancellor, Norman Lamont.
I am sceptical whether the European Union has any reason to exist in today's world. I think it's yesterday's answer to the day before yesterday's problem, basically. Indeed, I think, arguably, the only justification for the European Union continuing to exist is to look after Eastern Europe. What was the original justification of the European Union? To lessen tension and to prevent wars in Europe. Where is the greatest threat of instability and of war? In Eastern Europe. And I believe the European Union has a role to play in underpinning democracy, underpinning market reforms, the move to free enterprise. So far, I think the response of the European Union to the great events in Eastern Europe has been appallingly inadequate.
And yet, to shore up democracy, doesn't the European Union need to be a deep union?
No, I don't agree with that. I think there is inevitably some conflict between widening and deepening, and the French are quite right. That is one reason the British favour enlargement. It is partly for idealistic and high-principled reasons, but it is also, frankly, for the reason that a wider community will be a more diluted community. I make no secret of that. I want a more diluted European Union, and the bigger it is, the less centralised it will be.
So the prospect of enlargement has Eurosceptics rubbing their hands with glee. But will Central and Eastern European countries be prepared to play their game by coming in and weakening the Union? Jarosław Pietras is a young star in the Polish government who's been negotiating his country's proposed entry into Europe.
The membership in the Union is to solve our own problems, because membership in the Union is not the value in itself, it's for something. And without functioning Union, we are unable to solve our problem while being a member. Therefore, we would like to have a Union which is democratic, with well-defined procedures, and deep enough to maintain homogeneity of the solutions of the economic process. What we would like to have is that Union is not only a simple economic animal, but it's a political creation.
Although Poland and other countries argue that they want a deeper, more political union, underlying this argument is the knowledge that it's from this sort of Europe that they'll surely benefit the most. The more political the union, the more likely it'll be committed to policies of redistribution and cohesion. In other words, lots of financial assistance to countries in the East. So the Eurosceptics who hope to dilute Europe by pushing enlargement may well bring about the opposite effect. Edwina Currie, one of the Conservative Party's most outspoken pro-Europeans, has just returned from Poland, where she's been promoting democracy, and her book, Parliamentary Affair, about the fun and games that go with it.
I suspect some colleagues really misunderstand and perhaps underestimate the will of a country like Poland to get in. Poland sees the European Union as a guarantee not only of its security but of its identity. They also recognise that if we do ever develop a proper defence policy, then they would be on the inside, not on the outside. And I have to say, good for them. That's exactly the attitude I would have if I was Polish. So my colleagues here who think that this is going to be much harder to weld together, I think are probably wrong. And I suspect that they will find that some of these countries will not be our allies when we're trying to make things difficult. In fact, we are more likely to be outvoted by 19 to 1 than we are 14 to 1, which is tending to happen at the moment.
Any student of history would understand why Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries want a union which is more than a free trade zone. Trade and diplomacy didn't prevent the First or Second World Wars. And have British Eurosceptics given enough thought to the consequences of a diluted, weakened Europe on the united Germany, soon to be run from Berlin? Historian and writer Timothy Garton Ash rather famously called to Chequers in 1990 to advise Mrs. Thatcher on the German question, is now based at St Antony's College, Oxford.
If we don't succeed in making sure that Germany is bound in to a larger European Union, so that Germany has Western neighbours to its east, Germany would be almost compelled to pursue a national policy in the East. Whether the traditional policy of an understanding with Russia over the heads of the East Europeans, or a policy of building a German-dominated Middle Europa against Russia, either of these variants are unfortunate and in the long term dangerous. If we fail to find a common European agenda with Germany, which consists in strengthening the European Union and in enlarging the European Union, which is now a vital German interest, then Germany will set an agenda of its own.
The future role of Germany should give Tory Eurosceptics pause for thought. Yet their instinct that it'll be very difficult to enlarge and deepen the Union at the same time could well be right. We see this already in the fact that not all Central and Eastern Europeans are being seriously considered. Each applicant has to show that they meet the Union's criteria of democracy, human rights, a market economy, and the administrative capacity to apply European rules. At present, they're being required to complete 200-page questionnaires on the subject. At the top of the list for admission are the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. Behind them are Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And still further back are the Baltic states. The likes of Turkey and Morocco are widely accepted to be out of contention. But even if only the first 3 applicants are admitted, will enlarging the Union spell an end to a deeper Europe? How does Labour see this? Joyce Quinn is their spokesperson on Europe. Before becoming a Westminster MP, she was one of this country's first group of directly elected members of the European Parliament.
Labour supports the idea in principle of moving towards monetary union. What we do worry about, however, are the economic circumstances which may possibly surround the creation of that single currency. We don't want to see a very successful core of countries and then an increasing gap between those countries which are not part of the central core.
So for Labour there's a real conflict between widening and deepening the union, because if we go ahead with monetary union or any other deepening, we make a core union which the new members are going to find more difficult to move through transition towards.
I think it is difficult to try and do these ambitious things all at once. But I think that we have got to proceed with enlargement because there is a real political will in Europe to try and build on economic cooperation and move in the direction of monetary union. And I think that, therefore, we have got to travel down both paths at the same time. France and Germany, obviously, particularly at the moment, see themselves as the motor of the strengthening and deepening process. But at the same time, they know, and particularly Germany, which is very keen on enlargement, those countries know that they've got to attempt widening as well as deepening. I don't believe that they envisage a two-tier Europe. Both countries often, frequently warn against a two-tier Europe. I don't think that France and Germany see a core of countries which are going full speed ahead and leaving everybody else far behind.
I am a strong advocate of a strategy of core Europe, building inside this European Union. And if you don't get it from all of the 15 or the coming 19 or more, then what you want to go for is a deepening, at least within a smaller group, a subgroup inside the European Union.
Dr. Christian Deubner from the Ebenhausen Institute for International Politics and Security, favourite advisors of Chancellor Kohl. His desire for a small, cohesive elite of states within the Union reflects the German Chancellor's vision of a powerful Europe founded on the Franco-German relationship. But what does that mean for enlargement?
One of the most reasonable models for Eastern enlargement was this model of graduated accession via a zone of association, a kind of waiting room of association. Waiting room, a word which we must never use vis-à-vis the Central and Eastern European countries, evidently. I see this as the only way in which we have a hope to preserve European integration deepening, and for the whole of the European Union to go on the same way, and supporting Eastern enlargement. The core elements of integration logic reside in market integration. That's something which is really shared only by the relatively well-developed industrialized member countries inside the present European Union.
It's hardly surprising to hear German voices supporting a core union. For those who want to and can meet the criteria for monetary union, it's an attractive approach. But what does it mean for those in the waiting room? Otto Pick has enjoyed a career in several European countries before being lured back home to be director of the Institute of International Relations and professor at the Charles University in Prague.
I think it's a very unreasonable approach. I think it's a foolish approach, it's a patronizing approach, and the reaction of the people in the waiting room is the same as yours or mine. We go to the dentist with a raging toothache, and we sit there and we wait, and suddenly the tooth stops aching. We are just as likely to walk out of the waiting room as to go on waiting for the dentist. This could very well happen with some of the Central European states. It's an attitude which I think arises from the basic fact that nobody expected this to happen. Nobody expected the Cold War to end. Neither the European Union, nor NATO, nor anybody else had any kind of political scenario of what to do if the Soviet influence were withdrawn from Central Europe. And now, for the last 5 years, we've been staggering from short-term solution to short-term solution, from palliative to palliative. Actually, the terms under the association treaties for the Central European countries are no better than the terms they had under the 1988 trading agreements with the Commission.
Central and Eastern Europeans are frustrated that so little's happened since 1989. The restlessness of the waiting room is made sharper by the fact that they believe they've got a lot to offer Europe. Jarosław Pietras from Poland.
We are not coming empty-handed to the European Union. First, we've got the common heritage, and we can contribute to the common heritage which is created right now. Secondly, there is instability in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe could endanger stability here. We would like to maintain very good relationship with Russia, and what we think we could add to the European Union understanding of Russia. Thirdly, in economic field, countries of Central and Eastern Europe are growing quite rapidly. Markets are developing. Central Europe can contribute to overall competitiveness of Europe. In a number of areas, European countries will not be so competitive without having some production done in Central and Eastern Europe. And therefore, one would say there is a historical reason why countries of Central Europe could be entitled to rejoin Western Europe, and why Western Europe should meet these aspirations. But the real question is whether there is enough political motivation to move this process forward swiftly.
Since the heady days of 1989, there has already been a great sobering up. A very liberal Polish human rights activist said to me, when I hear the word Europe, I reach for my revolver. A lot of people are very depressed at the meanness of the West European response to the biggest thing to happen in Europe since 1945, and specifically to the covert protectionism, which they see very clearly. Their markets are flooded with Western goods. Their goods still have difficulty in getting into Western Europe. And there is a real danger of a turning away to nationalist policies. We have seen this reaction already in Croatia. We've seen this reaction in Slovakia. It is not impossible that we could see it in the countries which are right next door to us, or at least right next door to Germany.
Timothy Garton-Ash. Our meanness and covert protectionism might well force these countries to turn away from the European Union. But why don't we let them? Why not keep them out of the Union while they're still economically backward and we're still trying to complete the single currency? In this way, we could restrict their impact on us by using import barriers to keep their goods out and border controls to keep out migrants, refugees and cross-border crime. Is this an alternative?
You're proposing a European Rio Grande, 5 minutes flying time from the capital of United Germany, from Berlin. This is unthinkable. This is to erect a new Berlin Wall at Reading. It is the distance that Reading is from London, and we, the West, are to build a Berlin Wall. It's simply not on. However, when we start talking seriously about enlargement, which we're not doing yet, then we can say to them, it may not be in your interest and it may not be in our interest to have completely free movement of labor, for example, immediately. Let's talk about a transition period on that. You don't want all your best workers coming west. Our unemployed can't take that. We can talk about all these things. I'm sure that the Poles and the Czechs and Hungarians would be very open to long transition periods.
This is a very compelling argument. Enlargement, it would seem, is the only moral option. Does this mean that everyone in Brussels is pulling out the stops to bring it about? Graham Mather is president of the conservative think tank, the European Policy Forum, and a member of the European Parliament.
In politics, you have to make a virtue of the inevitable, and European enlargement is inevitable, and that's why you won't find anyone in the chancelleries of Europe who publicly go on the record to say we're not keen about this, we wish it wasn't happening. Everyone adopts a fixed grin and says as cheerful as they can, yes, we're delighted this is coming along, even if they look over their shoulder rather doubtfully at some of the consequences of what that means for their pet European project.
But do the fixed grins actually conceal a hidden reluctance?
In my view, there is a covert opposition to enlargement of the Union in the sense of a foot dragging, in the sense of a not bursting a blood vessel to make it happen. in the sense of hoping that perhaps some of the new member states won't meet all the criteria, that the negotiations will be protracted, that it wouldn't matter if a 5-year delay happened and it wasn't at the year 2000, it was 2005. I think that is, shall we say, conventional Brussels opinion.
Covert opposition to enlargement is being hidden behind a convenient cover of delay. Only preliminary steps have so far been taken. The Commission has produced a white paper on preparing for enlargement, and some countries have been given associate status. So why the foot-dragging? The first reason is attitudes, both in the West and the East. German advisor Christian Deubner worries that the newcomers see the European Union as the promised land. From his particularly sophisticated vantage point, the political classes in the East look somewhat naive.
I have had a Hungarian friend describe the march of the Central and Eastern Europeans towards the European Union as a kind of march of the children of Israel to Canaan, to the praised land. That's to say, they don't even exactly know what it is. They only know that they want to get there. The European Union is a symbol for everything which is modern, which is good, which is rich, which we'd like to be as well. That's not what the European Union is. I mean, it's not Canaan, but a complicated bureaucratic system. And secondly, there is a disillusionment vis-à-vis the hesitations of the European Union, the visible hesitations, the visible feelings of superiority of this European Union vis-à-vis its poorer and less developed eastern neighbors, and vis-à-vis the visible efforts inside Western Europe to reduce today already the risk that they'd have to spend too much money on the newcomers once those newcomers will be in. I mean, after all, these people can read French and German and English newspapers, and they can inform themselves on the debates going on inside Western Europe about them.
They certainly have been reading our newspapers, and opposition to Europe has started emerging in Central and Eastern Europe. Professor Otto Pick from Prague explains why the latest opinion polls in the Czech Republic suggest that 25% of the population oppose joining the Union.
There are people there who really think that Brussels is an extensively bureaucratic setup, and of course bureaucracy is a Central European disease anyway, and they don't want to compound it. Secondly, of course, this European Union is regarded by these people, both on the right and the left extremes of the political spectrum, as a German racket. Right? It is a way of entrenching German economic hegemony in the area, and therefore they're against it. And 25% is about right, and I think this is also a generational question. That percentage will go down as people die off. And younger people, if you look at the age distribution of the sampling, the younger people are all for it in a much more determined way. On the other hand, of course, as more and more propaganda is spread about the European Union, as more and more evidence comes about that Brussels, for example, wants bananas to be straight rather than bent, or cucumbers to be bent rather than straight, I forget what it is, more people will say, to hell with this, who needs this?
So news of straight bananas and bent cucumbers has reached the East. The final reaction Otto Pick mentions, to hell with this, who needs this, is not so different to that of Western Europeans when they ponder another problem of enlargement, the costs. Widening the existing union will cost a lot of money. Nowhere is this more clearly illustrated than in the common agricultural policy. The European Union spends by far the largest portion of its budget subsidizing agricultural production. On some estimates, it would cost around £30 billion to extend this to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, a sum which would bankrupt the Union budget. Professor Keith Middlemiss.
Just take the admission of Poland. That will break the common agricultural policy wide open. Take Poland and Hungary together even wider. Now, it's quite impossible, given the reforms that have already taken place in the common agricultural policy, for France and Germany, Italy and Spain to accept changes of that magnitude. Because Poland and Hungary are such grain baskets that unless the common agricultural policy is modified in a way which is not yet clear, or unless the Poles and Hungarians simply refuse to take the benefits, I think farmers will lose, but then they're losing pretty rapidly all round and having to adapt anyway.
So opposition inevitably means delay and drawn-out negotiations. But Graham Mather thinks this could actually be an advantage.
A pragmatist says that gives us 3 or 4 years to do some reform. We're already looking at reforms of the CAP and the budget squeeze on member states, not least arising because of another union policy, Maastricht and the single currency, will mean that people will look again at structural funds. So the optimist case is that by the time of enlargement, Europe will have put its own house in order, and the bad news that the new countries can't expect large handouts will be accompanied by a rearrangement of these programs for the rest of the Union as well.
Some reform of the CAP has already occurred, but critics hope that enlargement will go much further and either kill it or at least guarantee a major shake-up. But there's a lot the critics are overlooking. Politically, any radical reform would be extremely difficult in present circumstances. After 4 years as a European Commissioner and a year as Director General of the GATT, now the World Trade Organization, Peter Sutherland, Chairman of Goldman Sachs, is well placed to understand what's at stake.
As the Common Agricultural Policy, by its definition, is all-embracing, it is a sine qua non, I believe, for full membership, that one should participate in the Common Agricultural Policy. The development of a community which includes some who are within the only truly common policy that we have and some who are outside it, I think is a denial of the membership itself. It means that you're a member of something else, a free trade area or whatever. But the termination of the Common Agricultural Policy is something which would go to the core of the community itself. It is one of the fundamental principles which allowed the community to develop. I mean, it is a core element, and particularly in times of high unemployment and social tensions, the abolition of the Common Agricultural Policy doesn't arise. So I believe that the adoption of the Common Agricultural Policy is one of the thorny and difficult issues, but one which inevitably will have to be grasped.
But rather than grasp the thorns, politicians may well simply avoid them and rely instead on long transition arrangements which will protect existing policies. Again, this is a further reason why they're not moving fast towards enlargement. And there's yet another reason, the disruption it'll bring to Europe's institutions. MEP Graham Mather.
One thing is very clear, as the former French Prime Minister Edouard Balladur put it, a Europe of 20 or 24 or 27 member states cannot possibly be federal. It cannot possibly be integrated in the traditional sense. Europe, with new members, will test itself, possibly almost to destruction. So if Europe, when the new members arrive, is structured on a basis really, as it is now, for the original 6, with a few other countries bolted on, then in my view, it won't work, it won't prosper. If Europe has pre-established a variable geometry system, if Europe has allowed countries to take part at different levels, at different speeds, and in some cases not at all, then I think enlargement is handleable.
New members will mean more voters in the Council of Ministers, more commissioners in Brussels, and yet more MEPs in Strasbourg. To handle enlargement, variable geometry proposes that countries participate à la carte in Europe. The northern countries might group together to protect workers' rights. On agriculture, it might be southern Europeans, Poland and Hungary. This is a more laissez-faire model than Chancellor Kohl's vision of a stable core of countries committed to political and economic union. But both models aspire to create a single market, and each is likely to produce a Europe with a first class, perhaps a business class, and an economy section. But what will be needed to fly the plane? Professor Helen Wallace, Director of the Institute of European Studies at Sussex University, is one of Britain's most prominent scholars of European integration.
I don't myself think you can sustain the single market in the properly worked out sense unless there's a high degree of political commitment between countries, and unless there are pretty strict common rules, that's to say a strong court of justice, and a commission or something like the commission able to be a pretty effective regulator and policeman. That's not a soft option. So if you take the economic side to mean at least a single market, I don't think that's an easy ride at all. What we need is a European Commission that's powerful enough to stand down, face down the potential vetoers of the policies that will be needed to help East Europeans, but which carry short-term costs for Western Europe. In that sense, the European Commission's got to be able to be tough enough to stand down the farmers' organisations, to face down the textile producers or the textile workers when they try to put roadblocks in the way of helping East European economies to expand.
So why don't we strengthen Europe's institutions and give the Commission more power to face down sectional interests? We could do this by ending the power of veto that countries have over most issues in the Council of Ministers. This is a hotly controversial plan. Already it's the case that a majority, rather than a unanimity, of governments in the Council can make laws in some areas, a change which has given more power to the Commission. But this kind of reform is strongly opposed by Eurosceptics, who propose instead that enlargement should lead us back to being a Europe of nations. Peter Sutherland's experience in the Commission gives him an insight into how this debate is developing.
There are those who fear that some who advance the argument about increasing the membership and enlarging the community are doing so with the ulterior motive, partial ulterior motive, of diluting the essence of the Union and making it effectively unworkable as a supranational institution. But I believe that that will be the real debate, because I do not believe that we can enlarge without everybody agreeing that there have to be changes, for an example, in qualified majority voting, and that means that there will be a further reduction in the power of individual states and a further enhancement in the development of the European Union as a whole. It is not sustainable for many Europeans that we should have enlargement at the price of destroying the European Union.
Some Europeans would rather dump enlargement than jeopardize the institutions they already have and the Europe that they're planning. This is a further reason why enlargement is taking a long time to negotiate. But there's still more. Enlargement will create a clearly defined group of losers in Western Europe. These include small businesses and farmers, and perhaps most importantly, the unemployed. We're already facing record levels of unemployment. Will enlargement exacerbate the situation? James Lister Cheese is a business analyst and East European expert at the consulting group Independent Strategy.
It's a political hot potato. Further foreign direct investment would only serve to increase the level of unemployment in selected industries, particularly in basic manufacturing, which are the areas in which Central Europe is most competitive. Essentially, what will happen is that Central Europe will increasingly become involved in the lower value-added areas of manufacturing, while Germany in particular, but Western Europe as a whole, will move up the value-added scale of production, moving into services. For example, designing the cars instead of building them, designing the facilities to build the cars instead of building the cars. Increasingly, what it means is that the geographic definition of Western Europe will shift and become different from the corporate definition of Western Europe. You'll actually see a move away of production, away from the geographic heart of Europe, to areas where it's easier to sell and easier and more cost-efficient to produce.
Europe's centre of gravity is shifting, at least in corporate terms. If it's shifting eastward, what will this mean for Britain?
The UK may actually be seen as a loser in the whole process, given that up till now it's one of the main beneficiaries of direct investment coming into Europe. Something like 50% of the foreign direct investment projects that have come into Europe have actually been destined towards the UK in the last couple of years. If the Central European countries share the legal benefits and the trade benefits and the economic benefits of EU membership, then clearly their attractiveness as foreign direct investment destinations is enhanced. But clearly at the moment there is a quality gap and a productivity gap which justifies the level of investment in the UK relative to those in Central Europe. Although clearly the Central European countries are catching on to the fact that they have to be more productive and that they have to improve quality if they are going to continue to attract significant amounts of foreign direct investment.
So we'd better watch out. If this analysis is right, they'll be catching up with us soon. Perhaps this is one aspect of enlargement that politicians are reluctant to discuss. The possibility that it will create more unemployment and less investment here. Not a problem, says Norman Lamont. Keeping East European goods out is no answer. Instead, we should trust the market.
We ought to allow them to sell their goods here. After all, these are countries that have been shackled by communist economies, Marxist orthodoxy for decades. Suddenly they throw off communism and we say, well, hooray, but you're not allowed to sell your goods here. We don't want any Polish beef here, we don't want any Hungarian grain here. My goodness, sell it elsewhere, because we don't want to know, because that will endanger our high living standards in Western Europe. Frankly, it's an appalling and pathetic response.
But are you worried that British low-paid workers, for example, in manufacturing and industry, might lose their jobs if we enlarge to the east?
We face that danger everywhere. We live in a global economy. The low-cost producers are coming on stream, not just in Central Europe, but also in the Far East. I think it's quite wrong to be opposed to the poor of the world getting richer. I'm very strongly in favour of the poor of the world getting richer. The attitude that your question suggests is that of a 19th century landowner saying, I don't want the peasants or the people living on the land to own any property or to earn a decent living.
Although, of course, that's the way a lot of political constituencies see the enlargement of Europe.
But it is very short-sighted, and it's not the way the world is going to go, and it's not the way the world ought to go.
It's refreshing to hear how far Norman Lamont thinks we've come since the 19th century. But is he right? British people are worried about holding on to their jobs, their businesses and investment in their region. If enlargement makes these people losers, it'll also make them hostile voters. Helen Wallace recognises this problem, but she thinks it can be overcome.
There's no easy passport to a calm, problem-free Europe. Nonetheless, if you add up all of the economies, potentially, of Eastern Europe and their populations, it's 100 million people or so. That's potential markets, it's potential economic growth. There's more chance, if you take a long-term view, of economic growth in Europe being prompted by East European expansion than from Western Europe. There's a problem of time perspective, because some of the costs to the West Europeans may be thought to come rather quickly, whereas the gains come much more slowly. We have to accept that we're going to have to offer some sweeteners in Western Europe in order to enable people to contemplate the consequences of Eastern enlargement. I myself don't think those sweeteners are so necessarily so much more expensive than either the cost we've paid in the past for maintaining the Cold War in the old days, or the potential costs that we would face if we had serious instability in Eastern Europe, displaced and disgruntled populations. So I think it depends on how you weigh the costs and benefits.
But politicians at the moment are heavily constrained by the desire to join the European Monetary Union and to meet the convergence criteria for doing so. How is it that they could possibly justify increasing expenditure in these directions?
Not necessarily increasing expenditure, it's reallocating expenditure from one place to another. Some of it's by relocating expenditure within the European Community's budget. Some of it's to do with reducing expenditure on other forms of common defence in order to put it into other kinds of transition support for Central and Eastern Europe. It doesn't necessarily have to be large net gains in public costs. What it may mean is not the large net savings that some people had hoped for from the end of the Cold War. That depends on whether politicians are prepared to go out and make that argument.
But lots of those savings have already been spent. In the end, politicians will have to be open with voters and persuade them that enlargement is worthwhile and worth spending money on, in spite of the costs and disruption it'll bring. The most compelling argument we've heard, other than the moral imperative, is that we should do it for security, to ensure that the nations of Central and Eastern Europe do not become the lands between, a zone of competition between East and West. Security, then, is the linchpin of enlargement. But is this reasoning right? Labour spokesperson for Europe, Joyce Quinn, thinks that our security needs could be met in other ways.
Labour believes that the prime security needs will continue to be met for the foreseeable future through NATO. Certainly the European Union has members who have not been part of NATO, and for that reason it's hard to imagine that the membership of the European Union would be identical to membership of a defence or security organisation. And so that is why we feel that NATO is best placed to provide security needs. Also, of course, the transatlantic relationship is important, and so is the need for NATO to reach outwards to the east, to eventually include countries of Central and Eastern Europe, but at the same time not create a new Iron Curtain further to the east. So, of course, the relationship with Russia and states bordering on Russia is also going to be important and quite a delicate one to negotiate for the future.
Fine, except that if we bind these countries into NATO, we haven't dealt with the Russian problem. We might even exacerbate it by making Russia feel encircled. Of course, if we first enlarge the European Union, perhaps we can indirectly bring our neighbours into NATO without offending Russia. But there are even stronger reasons why we can't rely upon NATO on its own to secure Europe. As the alliance's main member, the United States, argues, Europe needs to build up the capacity to deal with its own security problems. In the event of border disputes, minority unrest, or problems of nationalism, the United States doesn't want to police Europe for us in NATO. So there's a strong security reason why we should enlarge the European Union, even if it's not yet clear whether this will bring us long-term economic advantages. But will the security argument, and the moral imperative, be enough to sway politicians and persuade voters to accept the costs of enlargement? Conservative MP Edwina Curry has great confidence in her Derbyshire South constituency.
My constituency is a big manufacturing area. We have the European Toyota factory, we have Rolls-Royce Aero engines, we are manufacturers in a big way and big exporters. So we have to be pro-European in my part of the world, in the industrial Midlands. But traditionally my local young men have joined the army, the Staffordshire Regiment, the Cheshire Regiment and so on. They have served in Europe. Their fathers and grandfathers died in Europe on the beaches to bring other countries to the freedom that we enjoy. So I don't need to explain to them the value of peace and cooperation between nations. They tell me about it instead. But peace and safety and freedom are not given. They are always worked for, they're always fought for. And we must not let complacency get in the way. We should never believe that these things are forever. We have to work for them and we have to maintain them.
This is no easy matter. The present European Union ensures peace, freedom and safety by operating as a powerful political forum. It's overcome the weaknesses of previous European organisations, like the League of Nations, by being much more than a talking shop. Policymakers from all the member states not only know each other, they legislate together and share common purposes and interests across a broad range of issues. It's this Europe that's so difficult to enlarge. Effectively to do so requires both widening and deepening, and the widening can't stop at Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic. If we're going to shore up security in Europe, we'll have to continue the process and admit up to 9 others. This is an ambitious programme, but at least the moral case for it has already been won, according to Timothy Garton Ash.
5 years ago, I vividly remember arguing at a conference in early 1990 that the newly liberated countries of Central Europe must be brought into the EU and NATO. And all the great and the good threw up their arms in horror. This was utter heresy. We have won the argument. And we have won the argument because it is an obvious nonsense to have an entity which calls itself Europe, which contains Greece but not Poland, this is like having a Britain that contains Orkney and not Lancashire. So the argument has been won. The opponents have been shamed into saying yes but rather than saying no. It will be very difficult indeed to explain to an unemployed worker in Lancashire why this is the most important thing to do in Europe, but that's what politicians are for, to put long-term interests before short-term interests. Our problem is our useless political class, which can't get its act together anyway.
But is this really fair? It's the politicians who have to explain to workers in Lancashire, Bavaria or Catalonia why money and jobs must be relinquished for enlargement. They know that there's a moral case, and probably a security case too. But it's hardly surprising that they're moving at a snail's pace. If Europe were united and the present 15 members agreed on its future direction, one complicating factor would be removed. But the question of cost would still remain. It seems we're not prepared to subsidize full membership for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So it's probably inevitable that economy seats will be added to a European Union which is already building a first class and a club class. This will be the shape of Magna Europa.
This week's analysis, Magna Europa, was presented by Dr. Ngaire Woods of the University College, Oxford, and produced by Ingrid Hassler. The editor is Nicola Merrick.